So today we're going to be talking about one of the major existentialist philosophers of the 20th century, who was Sartre. But before going into the reading that we're going to discuss, called Existentialism is Humanism, I want to spend a little bit of time recapping the previous ethical systems we encountered and what they assumed about human nature. So real quick, I know we've done it before, but no harm in doing it again. Can someone state the three or so authors we've encountered so far, and what schools of ethical philosophy they advanced, and what was like the sort of core principle for each of them? I can go first. Aristotle's ethics were rooted in an idea of virtue, which in turn was anchored in a very specific idea of human essence being a term that Sartre is going to focus on a good deal in this paper. But how about the other two sort of major schools of ethical and moral thought we encountered so far? Don't be shy. Okay, so I see in the chat from Edwin, yes, Kant would represent another major school of moral philosophy that we encountered. And the sort of key concept for him was duty, saying that the moral worth of a given action could only be evaluated in terms of whether or not the person doing it did so out of a sense of duty. And that in turn was anchored in Kant's formulation of moral law called the categorical imperative. So how about the last one of the three or so schools of moral philosophy we've encountered so far? Who was the author and what was the kind of core concept? I'm going to go back into the chat. Yes, Marlene wrote in the chat, Mill utilitarianism. Absolutely. That is the third one I was looking for. So for Mill, the touchstone of moral value was utility, or what he calls the greatest happiness principle. And there, in turn, he looked to what he termed the judgment of people with experience to establish what utility was and how the maximum amount of happiness could be achieved. So with each of those authors, you have Aristotle rooting his idea of ethics in a very specific notion of human nature, an idea of human essence. Kant would anchor his duty-based moral philosophy in the categorical imperative, which arguably in turn has an implied essentialism about human nature. Mill anchors his idea of utility, of the greatest happiness principle, by taking recourse to the judgment of people with experience. Each one of these authors seems to ground their moral philosophy in some kind of absolute, some kind of essence. So where the existentialists, coming in some cases centuries after this tradition of moral philosophy, sort of change the terms of the argument, will be that they reject that kind of foundationalism, establishing virtue ethics in an idea of human essence. Sartre will very explicitly state here that human beings don't come with instructions such as an essence. They have to take an alternate path to moral decision making. He'll similarly, and other existentialists will take exception with Kant's idea of duty. Part of their agenda of rejecting absolutes in human reality will require them to completely toss out this long tradition of moral philosophy and these three major schools of moral thinking. And a great deal of the reason for that is arguably just the violent and traumatic times that they were living in. Existentialism really arose in the years leading up to and then after World War II. So it's not a history class, but could someone quickly share what World War II was, and maybe touch on what effects would global war have on how thoughtful people view the world, in your opinion? Okay, no World War II buffs in the class, but that's perfectly fine. 1939 to 1945, European and other powers go to war with one another in a conflict that ends up spanning the entire globe, with casualties on the order of millions. This is the time when the Holocaust took place, the extermination of millions of Jewish and other innocent people. Although the Holocaust itself won't really come to public consciousness until some years after World War II ended. But during that period, 1939 to 1945, the visceral experience of people in Europe and throughout much of the rest of the world would have been witnessing wholesale destruction, not only of bodies of civilians and soldiers, but also entire towns and cities and ways of life. So this is going to create an atmosphere of crisis, a radical questioning of longstanding traditional values in religion and ethics, and sort of set the stage for thinkers, including the one we're talking about today, Jean-Paul Sartre, to seemingly wholesale reject a long tradition of moral thought as embodied by thinkers from Aristotle to Kant and Mill, and ask themselves if they can come up with an alternative way of just coping with their, in many ways, grim new realities. So before we get into the reading itself, I'm going to spend a bit of time talking a bit more about what existentialism is. So I hope that that would be one of our takeaways for today, is just getting a sense of what this, I think, very creative and powerful school of thought is all about. I also hope that we can get a strong sense of one of the key ideas from the essay we're talking about today, namely Sartre's contention that existence precedes essence and what follows from that. I think the last takeaway I hope we get today is, if one does accept Sartre's attacks on previous moral thinkers and his insistence that human beings have to look to a source other than God, that they have to look to themselves, then how does one, in fact, make moral decisions and decide what actions to be taken? So hopefully, last takeaway, we get a sense of how Sartre answers that problem. With that said, I'm going to share a few slides. So Sartre really lived during World War II, and in fact was imprisoned for a time during that conflict, and was really came to be the preeminent spokesperson for the school of thought that came to be known as existentialism. So there are a number of themes I just want to put on the table for what existentialism means. These come from a actually delightful book that's a bit of a creative biography and history of ideas called At the Existentialist Café by Sarah Bakewell. So highly recommend it if you have the time and inclination. And these are things that the existentialist author Sartre, his lifelong partner Simone de Beauvoir, and some other existentialist writers have in common. So coming from a place that is rejecting traditional schools of moral thought, like Aristotle, Kant, and Mill, these thinkers are concerned with individual, concrete human existence. In the reading for today, Sartre, and we have to take things as they are. the context there is actually a very atheistic one. He'll say, there is no sign of the existence of God on a day-to-day basis. Look to everyday reality and build off of that. And he'll also, in a sort of key theme for the reading, strongly emphasize the importance of action and state. There's no reality except in action. Existentialists also note that human existence is different from the kind of existence that other things have. Unlike clouds or animals, for instance, human beings are inclined to think about the nature of their being. They are free. Freedom is a key theme for existentialists, including Sartre. And because of that, we are responsible for everything we do. A nevertheless dizzying or even nauseating fact that causes anxiety. So in the reading for today and in many other existentialist writings, there's a strong sense, again, after the destruction of a long tradition of moral and religious feeling in Europe and elsewhere, that human beings are free, but they're on their own. They live in an existence that is just riven with anxiety. Another characteristic of existentialists, including Sartre, is an emphasis on the situations that human beings find themselves in. People are free, but it's not exactly an infinite, endless freedom. There are biological, psychological, historical, and social factors that one has to take into account for things like moral decision-making. As Sartre puts it around the middle of the essay for today, he'll say, other human beings are the condition of one's own existence. I'm not going to go through all the rest of this, but sort of in keeping with the insistence of existentialists like Sartre of focusing on everyday reality, existentialists, including him, were phenomenologists. That's a particular kind of philosophy that is concerned with the visible, touchable, smellable, audible world. And so focusing on that instead of, for instance, an ideal realm that Kant seems to have in mind, they seem to think that understanding that world and describing experience that takes place in it well, you can understand existence and eventually become awake to a more authentic life. So Sartre himself was, very much in his time the cream of the crop of the French-speaking intellectual world. He studied at France's top university, establishing himself early on as a brilliant and promising thinker. But the kind of education he would have gotten was very focused on ideal philosophy, especially the philosophy of thinkers like Kant. And Sartre spent his life's work really trying to get past that idealism and engage in what he called phenomenology. So a bit more on that term. It could be defined as the study of objects of consciousness as they are actually experienced, the real world, not the abstract world. Sartre, the practice of phenomenology, proceeds by a deliberate reflection on the structure of consciousness. His method is, in fact, a literary style of interpretive description of different types of experience in relevant situations. So a hallmark of Sartre's thought that we get a taste of today is that he not only describes the world in moral, sometimes almost metaphysical terms, but he's interested in understanding it through specific situations. So we get two very thought-provoking examples of those kind of situations today. A young Frenchman who has to decide between staying at home and helping out his mother or going and joining the resistance abroad. And there's a second example about a young Jesuit man. Sartre, like I've been starting to say, as a key figure in existentialism and really in public life. He was the kind of public intellectual, sort of the personification of public intellectual you just don't see that much anymore. And in that capacity, he would sound those key existentialist themes of freedom and responsibility. They'll also mention in passing that he was a Marxist who wrote novels, plays, and literary criticism. So what is existentialism? I mean, we get the definition of that term in the course of the essay for today, in which Sartre argues that it's a kind of humanism. So can anyone tell me if they've encountered that term before? Okay, I see in the chat. Okay, thank you, Edwin. It's the first time you're seeing it, which is perfectly fine with me. So humanism, very broadly speaking, their whole class is taught on it, but I think to sum it up for our purposes, we could think of it as an idea you could trace back to around the time of the Renaissance, when thinkers were looking to classics in philosophy and would end up insisting that human beings should be valued as deserving respect, in contrast with their immediately preceding thinkers from the Middle Ages, who, again, very broadly speaking, would have emphasized things like submission to God's will. So the humanist tradition, dating back to centuries before Sartre's time, is very much one that, broadly speaking, is interested in human dignity on human terms. So Sartre, in the course of this essay, will try to argue that existentialism does dignify humanity, in contrast to what the critics of Sartre's day were saying. I think the way he puts it on the first page of the reading, which hopefully everyone had a chance to do, is existentialism, in our sense of the word, is a doctrine that does render human life possible, a doctrine also which affirms that every truth and every action imply both an environment and a human subjectivity. At bottom, what is alarming in the doctrine that I am about to try to explain to you is it not that it confronts man with a possibility of choice? So hopefully that starts to fill out a bit both what existentialism and humanism in Sartre's sense of the term mean. But in almost the same breath, he will acknowledge that his atheistic idea of existentialism does entail anguish, abandonment, and despair. Early on, Sartre says there are two kinds of existentialists. There are Christian existentialists, which might be hard to believe based on the tone of Sartre's work, but I'll quickly mention in passing, maybe the most famous one is Kierkegaard, a pre-19th century philosopher who both articulated a lot of existentialist dilemmas and themes, but also did believe in God. And then the other kind, according to Sartre, is the atheist, like himself, who views human beings as alone in the world, a world without God. And especially thinking to the time Sartre and his peers were living in post-World War II, landscape of human devastation in Europe and beyond. Between that and atheism, the human condition could seem very bleak. It's a natural environment for feelings of anguish, abandonment, and despair. A challenge for Sartre and others like him will be avoiding taking that path to the point of nihilism. a view that nothing can be proven and that there is not even anything that is morally right or wrong. So Sartre will insist that existentialism is a doctrine that does render human life possible. So moving on to this really key idea from the essay for today, that existence precedes essence. Sartre is grappling with one of the almost timeless questions of philosophy. Is there such a thing as human nature? And if so, what does it entail? How do you define it? And I could pause my own monologue for a moment and ask all of you, do you think that there is such a thing as human nature? And if so, how do you define it?
I understand that there might be as a human nature because it portrayed us in like the way that we do things. I feel in it proves in our existence that we are an evolutionary species that we keep improving and yeah and well not naturally on a natural way because we've been using resources from other animals, but yeah.
So if human beings are, so thank you for that, Edwin. If human beings are continually improving,
Mm.
is there a constant human nature, or does human nature change over time?
It changed over time, yeah.
Got it. Okay, I think that that view um, is maybe not exactly the same as an existentialist view, but existentialists would definitely embrace the idea that human nature is somewhat variable. And the example that Sartre comes up with to sort of explain this idea of uh, existence preceding essence, I think is a very brilliant one. He talks about a knife and a knife maker. So if anyone had the opportunity to check out the reading, can someone sort of recap what that example was to Sartre and what it proves about existence and essence? Okay, so the example for Sartre is, like I was saying, a knife and a knife maker. He states that when a craftsperson sets out to make a knife, he already has sort of the plan of what that knife will be like in his mind before he sets about making it. And the construction of the knife is the fulfillment of that plan. One could think of the plan for a knife as its essence. And the essence, in the case of the knife, which is sort of lodged in the craftsperson's mind, uh, precedes the actual real world physical existence of the knife. And Sartre points out a Christian or someone who believes in God would think of human nature as something similar. Instead of a plan for a knife in the mind of a craftsman existing or having priority, having essence before it exists, a Christian might say the plan or essence for a human being exists in the mind of God before God gives human beings existence. Sartre is going to say that that's completely wrong, and that even if you take out an explicitly Christian articulation of essence, it is wrong for a thinker like Aristotle to say that human beings enter the world with an almost predefined essence and that existence comes afterwards, in a sense. Sartre will say the exact opposite is the case, and that existence precedes essence. We come into the world, and it is only in the world and through experience that we acquire and in fact create an essence. So could someone please read this paragraph on this slide here? Don't be shy. Okay, Edwin, you've already spoken, which I greatly appreciate. How about someone who hasn't spoken yet? Amir, go for it.
What do we mean by saying that existence precedes essence? We mean that man first of all exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself afterwards. If man, as the existentialist, sees him as not definable, it is because, to begin with, he is nothing. He will not be anything until later, and then he will be what he makes of himself. Thus, there is no human nature, because there is no God to have conception of it. Man simply is, not that he is simply what he convinces himself to be, but he is what he wills. And as he conceives himself after already existing, as he wills to be after that leap towards existence. Man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself. That is the first principle of existentialism.
Okay, thank you, Amir. So this to me is a very powerful passage, and really one of the key ones from existentialism is humanism. Man, first of all, exists and defines himself afterwards. So we have here contained a sort of clue for Sartre's kind of theory of moral decision making. He's sketching that human beings define themselves, including their own values. And it's not the case that we enter the world with instructions from God or a higher authority, or that, as Kant argued, there's a categorical imperative that reason gives to itself. I mean, if reason is going to give anything to itself, it won't be an absolute or take the form of the almost kind of moral instructions that Kant talks about. But at the same time, we also get a whiff of the anxiety that Sartre will talk about explicitly later in the essay. I mean, there's this very provocative clause toward the beginning of this passage. To begin with, he is nothing. And if you really try to mull that or meditate on it, that could seem like a very scary proposition. When someone is born and enters the world, they are nothing. We are born alone. No one is going to tell us what to do. I mean, maybe people will try, but no one with true authority can do that. We're on our own to create our own values, I think Sartre might say. And he takes that idea that human beings define themselves after they exist. They acquire an essence afterwards, in a sense, very literally, and also very much in terms of action. It's around page 8 that Sartre says, what we mean to say is that a man is no other than a series of undertakings, that he is the sum, the organization, the set of relations that constitute these undertakings. So would someone care venture to say what that means? So a kind of complementary idea to Sartre's thesis that existence precedes essence is his idea of subjectivity. So if there are no instructions that we enter the world with, if there's no plan for human beings divine or otherwise. There aren't objective values, according to Sartre. That leaves us in a world of subjectivity in two senses. What he elaborates it is, man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself. This is the first principle of existentialism, and this is what people call its subjectivity. Say, that critics of his day use that as a reproach against us. But Sartre's reply is, what we mean by human subjectivity is that man is of a greater dignity than a stone or a table. So here he's kind of flipping the criticism on its head. If you want to criticize existentialism as a form of the quietism of despair and state that the thesis of existence preceding essence deprives human beings of their dignity, Sartre will go back and say, like, well, if you think that essence is what precedes existence, you're basically saying human beings are the same as a table or a chair. Their plans or their essence exist in the mind of a creator before they enter the world. They'll argue that that is really an insult to human dignity. And then there's a second sense later on in the essay in which he defines subjectivity. Man cannot pass beyond human subjectivity, Sartre writes. When we say that man chooses himself, we do mean that every one of us must choose himself. But what we also mean is that in choosing for himself, he chooses for all men. To choose between this or that is at the same time to affirm the value of that which is chosen, for we are unable ever to choose the worse. This is like actually a very interesting and tricky passage and theme in general to me. I mean, first we get a bit more explanation of what might be called Sartre's theory of moral decision making, saying that it is in the act of choosing that we sort of imbue our actions with value. Okay, that's already debatable to me. But additionally, he asserts, again, in choosing for himself, one chooses for all men, which I think would be highly debatable. Also, you all tell me, does that remind you of any other thinker we've encountered? It reminds me somewhat of Kant and Kant's categorical imperative. To paraphrase the first formulation, it argued, act only in accord with that maxim that you can at the same time will become a universal law. This very deep idea of setting an example. In other words, Sartre is saying something that's pretty similar to me. In choosing for oneself, one chooses for all men. Whereas for Kant, he has a somewhat elaborate argument for why the moral law prescribes that kind of action. I'm not sure Sartre proves that when one chooses for oneself, one chooses for all men. Maybe there's an implication there that when I choose something, okay, that's what gives it value and meaning. And it implies that I think the same choice and action would have value and meaning for everyone. But I mean, there are possible counter arguments to that. And I'm not sure that Sartre actually proves the idea that when one chooses for oneself, one chooses for all men. So sort of question for the class I jotted down here, but doesn't seem like many people are in a talkative mood today, was, are people responsible for their actions and why or why not? So tell me if you have the off the cuff answer, but if not, I will move on to yet another theme in the reading, which is the theme of responsibility. And Sartre says humans enter the world with no God or absolute rules. and those conditions make them responsible for themselves. That's interesting. So Edwin wrote in the chat, Sartre refers to himself as a role model, while Kant refers to moral of society. I mean, I think you're onto something with that, Edwin, which is Sartre definitely takes what would be considered a more individualistic approach than Kant did. I mean, Kant is talking about a moral law for not just all of society, but for all rational beings. Sartre is here suggesting, or actually here stating, that individuals create their own values, really create their own morals. And he goes on to state that when one chooses for oneself, one chooses for all others. I find that debatable. That's an extension of the sort of initial premise of subjectivity. But I think you're exactly right, that Sartre is clearly taking a highly individualistic approach to moral thought. In keeping with that is his idea of responsibility. There is no God, according to Sartre and many other thinkers. We do not enter the world with instructions about what the moral life is and how to make decisions. We have to do that on our own. So Sartre, around page 5, will state, that is what I mean when I say that man is condemned to be free, condemned because he did not create himself, yet is nevertheless at liberty. And from the moment that he is thrown into this world, he is responsible for everything he does. So it's this very interesting kind of fusion of themes throughout the work, to my mind. A very dreadful, angst-ridden mentality that always seems to be lamenting the lack of existence of God. One is condemned, but at the same time, an insistence on how lack of higher authorities is in fact empowering. One is condemned, but one is condemned to be free. And as an aside, Descartes, being an ultra-educated writer in the tradition and deeply versed in the Western philosophical tradition, will put his existentialism in Cartesian terms. He'll state that, in fact, Cartesian subjectivity is the point of departure for his notion that existence precedes essence, although Descartes seemed to have more of an essentialist view than Sartre, certainly, and the existentialists. But he's drawing a distinction from Descartes, whereas if we think back to a few weeks ago, in which Descartes was very concerned with proving whether or not he exists, the kind of wild and eccentric thought experiment that permeates the first few meditations on first philosophy. And he goes on to state that he's proven God exists, that mathematical objects can be known, but then things in the so-called outside world, ordinary objects, seems Descartes is less willing to state things can be firmly known about them, and that might even include other human beings. So Descartes, in Sartre's reading, leaves one with a very enclosed, self-centered, in a literal sense of the way, sense of subjectivity, but Sartre seems to be elaborating a much more social subjectivity, what he calls intersubjectivity. He writes, contrary to the philosophy of Descartes, contrary to that of Kant, when we say I think, we are attaining to ourselves in the presence of the other, and we are just as certain of the other as we are of ourselves. Thus, the man who discovers himself directly in the cogito, Descartes' I think, also discovers all the others and discovers them as the condition of his own existence. This might be another debatable aspect of Sartre's thought. It's interesting, as we kind of go along. When I read Sartre, I find myself able to assent to really the more individual aspects of his thought. The idea that one creates value through the choices one makes and the actions one takes. And the idea that one's essence is created after one comes into the world and exists. It's the more social sides that I am not as sold on. Again, going back to the previous slide, the idea that, or no, it was just at the top of wherever it was on the slide, there was an idea that my choices are ones that I make for all humankind. I'm not sure that I'm sold on that. Similarly, this quote at the bottom of the slide, one attains to oneself in the presence of the other. Isn't it possible to assert one exists independently of other human beings, other thinking beings, as Descartes seemed to do? So again, it's the social side of Sartre's philosophy that I'm not sure I'm completely sold on. And so I want to get to what might be considered the case studies that Sartre provides in Existentialism is Humanism. And Sartre gives two of those. One of them is about a young student who's confronted with a choice between joining the war efforts. This is happening during World War II. Sartre definitely would have France in mind. And the other sort of case study is a young Jesuit who has struggled throughout life and is wondering how to make sense of it. Let's start with the first kind of case study, in which a student approaches Sartre. The student's father was quarreling with his mother and was also inclined to be a collaborator. That would have been a major issue during the France of World War II. The student's elder brother had been killed in the German offensive of 1940, and this young man, with a sentiment somewhat primitive but generous, we get these nice literary flourishes that are a sign of Sartre's novel writing side, burned to avenge him. His mother was living alone with him, deeply afflicted by the semi-treason of his father and by the death of her eldest son. And her one consolation was this young man. But he had the choice between going to England to join the Free French forces or staying near his mother and helping her to live. This would be a crucial dilemma for any young person. So just about everyone on this Zoom everyone on the Zoom, excluding me, is a student right now. Maybe we could ask ourselves, have we ever been in a similar situation? What competing responsibilities do we feel in our day-to-day lives, and how do we decide which ones to prioritize? Off the top of my head, going on a bit of a tangent, examples might be trying to decide between going to work or going to school. Huge dilemma arises all the time. You finished high school, do work, make money, support yourself, or you go to class. Maybe go to class and work part-time. It's like, well, if you work part-time, you're not going to make as much money as you would if you worked full-time. So do you really want to keep going to class? Similarly, do you have to care for relatives, children, parents? How do you decide which one to prioritize? So Edwin is putting in the chat, school. I very much appreciate that choice. I think it's always a strong choice, but sometimes it's not so straightforward. So in this particular example or case study, Sartre phrases it like this: how does one estimate the strength of a feeling? The student seems to have two feelings: feeling of loyalty to country, perhaps, wanting to go off and fight for the French cause. And then another feeling, a feeling of love or loyalty toward his mother, who would greatly miss his absence. What Sartre goes on to state is that it seems like there's no way to weigh one feeling over the other, to value one decision over the other, than by making the choice to act on that feeling or value. And it's only action which, in a sense, imbues a particular choice with value. Sartre states is, I can only estimate the strength of this affection if I have performed an action by which it is defined and ratified. Actions speak louder than words, right? It's all well, it might be all well and good for this particular student in this particular example to state, oh, I really love my mother, I'm so torn about the thought of abandoning her. But Sartre would point out that it means nothing if the student, if the student didn't make the choice to act on that feeling. So, at the same time, the student might say, I really hate the Nazi occupation of France. I strongly want to go leave home and volunteer for the resistance. So that's what said that those noble feelings don't have any meaning to the student unless the student sort of imbues it with value through choosing to act on those feelings. To put it another way, maybe you've encountered this idea before. It's kind of a cliche. You encounter someone socially who seems like a jerk or treated someone like a jerk, but someone will defend them and state, well, they're really a good person deep down. So in Sartre's existentialism, that is never a defensible position to take, because what supposedly happens in terms of our feelings deep down means nothing if we don't act on it. It is only action that shows what our values are. I see a comment in the chat. Oh yes, right on, Edwin. So I want to talk for a few moments about the other example, which is another interesting angle on Sartre's kind of theory of moral decision-making. He talks about a young man who lived a pretty destitute life, was taken into a school out of charity, didn't have much success, and he applied. I think he failed a military exam. He comes to grief in a sentimental affair. Sounds like unlucky in love. And this young man could regard himself as a total failure. It was a sign, but a sign of what? Sartre states, this young man took all of these external patterns in his life to be a sign from God that he was not destined for success in the secular world, in affairs or a career or in the military, but was in fact meant for a religious life. So what Sartre points out, one might call it somewhat snarky, is that even things in the external world that we might take to be signs, those signs are always a product of our decision. We choose how we interpret so-called signs from the outside world. He will elaborate. The moral choice is comparable to the construction of a work of art. Moral decision-making is kind of a work in progress, would be another way to put it. So Marlene wrote in the chat, greed doesn't have much meaning, but action takes a lot of courage, which many don't have. So I know what you mean by the second half of your sentence, Marlene, but what do you mean by the first half? What doesn't have much meaning? And maybe you're referring to the idea that feelings that we don't act on don't have much meaning on their own. Yeah, so I think you're putting an interesting word into the conversation, courage. I think Sartre would definitely state that it takes courage to embrace responsibility for our own actions and to kind of overcome the anguish and despair that arises from entering the world with no instructions from God, with no prefabricated essence. So I like that addition, that it takes courage. We can also ask, what else goes into Sartre's formula for moral decision making that maybe he's not explicit about? Something that could come up in maybe the second half of class, time permitting. Philosophy, that's going to be a class on philosophy of race, which is very concerned with uncovering not only hidden racism, but hidden modes of privilege. Are there any privileges, or is there even any racism that is sort of lurking in the philosophy we're talking about right now that Sartre is not explicitly acknowledging? So I think by now we've hit sort of the core of this essay, that existence precedes essence. Sartre has given us a theory of moral decision making, but he also elaborates from around the middle to the end of the essay on these key existentialist themes of abandonment, anguish, and despair. There is no God. People are abandoned, according to Sartre. What abandonment implies is that we ourselves decide our being. With this abandonment goes anguish. Around the same passage, Sartre gives us an idea of despair. We limit ourselves to reliance upon that which is within our wills or within the sum of the probabilities which render our action feasible. So Sartre will acknowledge, maybe not the need, I think he would acknowledge the need for courage, but he will be very aware that human possibility is not endless. I think the sort of examples or case studies that we were talking about illustrate that. And that existence of limitations in the human condition, I think by this point, it's hopefully clear that Sartre and other existentialists are much more interested in the human condition than in human nature. They're rejecting the idea that there is such a thing as a firm and stable human nature. They're going to focus on the condition instead. That condition is a limited one. And then it's around the middle of the essay that he points out so much of human calculation for actions and values seems to be a matter of probabilities. And that reinforces a sense of despair that could come with this worldview. Still, I'll point out in passing, in previous semesters, I would do maybe one class on Sartre, or one class on a fellow major existentialist author who was close friends with Sartre until they had a falling out. That's Albert Camus. Sartre will view reality, while full of freedom, as fundamentally full of abandonment, anguish, and despair. He'll stop short of a key thesis for Camus, which was that reality was in fact absurd. To continue and go off on a bit of a digression, there were a lot of fundamental absurdities, according to Camus. He, like Sartre, was an atheist. He viewed it as absurd that human beings seem to enter the world with a desire, a need to understand truths about philosophical questions, answers to which may not be attainable. They entered the world with a need for God, even though there was no God, according to Camus. So those kinds of contradictions would lead Camus to diagnose reality as a fundamentally absurd, contradictory, laden existence, Sartre seems not to take things quite that far. But I think his theses of abandonment, anguishment, and despair get the point across for existentialist purposes. So we'll say, as we wind down, a few more words about Sartre's emphasis on action. We'll state that in one sense, choice is possible, but what is not possible is not to choose. I can always choose, but I must know that if I do not choose, that is still a choice. So maybe if we have followed Sartre to the point, whether or not we're atheists, we might still agree with a sense of anguish, abandonment, and despair. Maybe we could take a look at the headlines in recent weeks, months, years, and feel like there's nothing that can be done to improve a social problem that we see on the news, or a personal problem with a friend, with a loved one. Sartre emphasizes that the decision not to take action is still a choice, and that there's really no way out of this dilemma of having to create one's own values and create one's own essence. And then his articulation with this sort of social dimension of existentialism is that resignation is my will for everyone, and my action is, in consequence, a commitment on behalf of all mankind. If I decide to withdraw, to resign, not to take action, according to Sartre, I'm committing all of humankind to do the same thing. Again, I find the logic there debatable, but that is Sartre's point of view. He spells out this sort of his view of action, that it presupposes a plurality of possibilities, and in choosing one of these, one realizes it has value only because it is chosen. And maybe it's not, to me, a completely straightforward and self-evident idea that the act of choosing is what imbues an action with meaning. But I do like, toward the end of the essay, a passage that I think makes that idea a bit more clear, which is where he compares this idea of moral decision-making to painting. If you bear with me one moment, I'll hopefully be able to find it. Almost there, just bear with me. Oh, yes. Does anyone reproach an artist when he paints a picture for not following rules established a priori, a term encountered in Kant, that have rules established before experience? Does anyone ever ask, what is a picture that he ought to paint? As everyone knows, there's no predefined picture for him to make. The artist applies himself to the composition of a picture, and the picture that ought to be made is precisely that which he will have made. As everyone knows, there are no aesthetic values a priori, but there are values which appear in due course in the coherence of the picture and the relation between the will to create and the finished work. No one can tell what the painting of tomorrow will be like. No one can judge a painting until it is done. What has that to do with morality? We are in the same creative situation. We never speak of a work of art as irresponsible. When we are discussing a canvas by Picasso, we understand very well that the composition became what it was at the time when he was painting it, that his works are part and parcel of his entire life. I think it's actually a very beautiful analogy. The idea that we create values by choosing to act on them the same way that an artist creates a painting through the process of specific decisions about brushstrokes. And in neither case, whether it's the creation of a painting or sculpture or something, or we're talking about the essence one creates for oneself over the course of life. In neither of those cases does the individual have a specific plan or essence in mind from the start. It's only through the act of painting, through the act of choosing which things to do, that the canvas takes shape, so to speak.